On the day I moved into Sunnyvale Court, the sky was a brilliant shade of blue, and a light breeze carried the scent of freshly mowed grass through the neighborhood. The real estate listing had boasted of this cul-de-sac's idyllic charm, a small series of houses with matching shutters, neat mailboxes, and manicured lawns. Everything seemed so peaceful. I had no idea I was stepping into a battleground of opinions orchestrated by the self-styled ruler of the Homeowners Association, a middle-aged woman named Beatrice Arland, referred to by nearly everyone, behind her back, as Karen. Beatrice was in her late 40s, with a short, practical haircut that somehow felt militaristic in its precision, and her favorite accessory was a clipboard, always tucked under her arm. Her demeanor was that of someone on a perpetual mission, eyes scanning, lips pursed in disapproval, always ready to swoop in and correct some perceived breach of HOA rules. Within my first few hours on Sunnyvale Court, she marched straight up my walkway and introduced herself as the community coordinator. She spoke in that condescending, overly sweet way some people use when talking to a toddler. "Well, dear," she'd said, "I'm the one you'll want to check with before making any big changes to your property. I know the guidelines like the back of my hand." She patted the clipboard with what was almost a sense of pride. "We've got standards to uphold." At the time, I smiled politely, thanked her for the information, and assured her I had no intention of breaking any rules. She gave me a tight-lipped nod, then promptly circled around the exterior of my house, without invitation, mind you, taking notes on a small notepad that she'd whipped from her pocket. She paused at the corner of the yard, frowned at a patch of dandelions, and scribbled something down. My introduction to Karen's domain was not exactly the warm welcome I'd hoped for, but I tried to brush it off as a quirk of living in a well-regulated neighborhood. In truth, I had specifically chosen this house for a very personal reason. I wanted a home with a decent yard where I could create a small memorial garden for my grandfather, who had recently passed away. He had been an avid gardener, spending countless hours cultivating flowers, especially bright geraniums and petite daisies. As a kid, I'd spent my summers helping him plant seeds, water flower beds, and tend to delicate sprouts. When he passed, I inherited some of his gardening tools, along with seed packets labeled in his neat handwriting. Creating a memorial flower bed was my way of honoring him. When the time came to start planting the garden, I leafed through old photos of his plots and rummaged through his old seed boxes. My intention was modest, a small circular patch in the front yard with a few stepping stones, a short picket border, and a modest plaque in his memory. I also wanted to add a simple bench where I could sit and reflect. Something peaceful, nothing extravagant. I drew up a quick sketch of the design, took pictures of the proposed area, and prepared to submit it to the HOA's architectural committee. In many neighborhoods, a simple flower bed might not require permission, but here, even minute alterations, like painting your shutters, demanded approval. So, with a mixture of nervousness and determination, I walked over to the small white building the HOA used as a makeshift office, document folder in hand. When I entered, Karen was seated behind a desk, wearing wire-rimmed glasses perched on the tip of her nose. She glanced up, recognized me, and gave a saccharine smile. "Oh, hello, dear," she said, as though I was a schoolchild asking for a hall pass. "What brings you in?" I explained my plan, the small memorial flower bed dedicated to my grandfather. I handed her my sketches, photos, and even the seed packets. She took them wordlessly, flipping through the pages with an air of bored detachment. Eventually, she arched an eyebrow. "A memorial garden?" she repeated. "You're aware that we have very strict guidelines about landscaping that might disrupt neighborhood aesthetics, correct?" I felt my stomach tighten. "I'm aware of the guidelines, but it's just a flower bed," I reasoned softly. I made sure to keep the design in harmony with the house and yard. She pursed her lips and placed the papers on her desk. "We usually don't permit benches in front yards. Did you check the guidelines? Any decorative features must be uniformly styled to match the rest of Sunnyvale Court, especially those visible from the street." "I saw that," I conceded, "but this bench is a simple wooden design, not bright or flashy, and the border fence is only a foot high, white picket, just like the main fence around the yard." She didn't budge. "We also have rules about signs or plaques. If you want a memorial plaque, it might have to adhere to certain size and style standards. And we can't allow the yard to look like a cemetery or memorial site. It's not in keeping with the neighborhood's image." Her words stung. The idea that a quiet remembrance for a beloved family member could be seen as an eyesore was heartbreaking. Still, I forced myself to remain calm. I'm willing to compromise on the plaque's design if necessary, I offered. I can make it smaller, or maybe incorporate it into a decorative stone. The main thing is to keep a few flowers in his memory. Karen sighed as though discussing a trivial annoyance. I'll have to bring this before the board. But I must warn you, I don't think they'll go for it. It might be too individualized. She flipped through the sketches one last time, her expression unyielding. But we'll see. I left the office feeling uneasy. It was painfully clear she found the idea of a memorial garden distasteful or inappropriate, though the logic behind that opinion baffled me. Nevertheless, I clung to a shred of hope that the board might be more compassionate. The HOA board meeting was held 2 weeks later, in a small function room near the entrance of the neighborhood. 5 board members presided at a folding table at the front, including Karen, who sat in the middle seat. About 20 neighbors attended, giving the event a peculiar blend of a town hall and a middle school assembly vibe. The first items on the agenda were mundane: reviewing the landscaping budget, discussing holiday decorations, and addressing a recent complaint about parked cars overlapping the sidewalk. Then it was my turn. I was called to the front to present my proposal. With trembling hands, I walked through my design, explaining its purpose. A small circle of flowers, a tiny picket fence, a stone bench, and a discreet plaque. I showed them pictures of my grandfather's gardens as well, hoping to convey how meaningful this project was to me. The board members eyed the materials. There was some hushed discussion among them, and I caught glimpses of their expressions. Some seemed sympathetic, others cautious. Karen, on the other hand, maintained a rigid posture, pen tapping against her clipboard. Eventually, Martin, one of the board members with a grandfatherly demeanor, spoke up. "Well, it certainly seems tastefully done," he said. "I don't see it being an eyesore." Karen interjected, voice firm. "But we must consider the broader precedent. If we allow one homeowner to build a personalized memorial, we could have others wanting statues, shrines, or who knows what else. It's not about whether it's an eyesore. It's about maintaining a cohesive neighborhood theme." A small wave of murmurs spread through the audience. Some nodded in agreement, but I noticed a few rolling their eyes. Another board member, Lucy, looked directly at me and asked, "Would you be willing to adjust the design if we find some aspects that conflict with the guidelines? For example, if the bench were placed in the backyard instead?" I explained that the front yard, with its morning sunshine, was perfect for the flowers I wanted to plant. Also, I liked the idea of passers-by seeing the memorial, maybe reminding them of the beauty of life or loved ones they'd lost. Karen leaned forward. "We have to ensure that the front yards remain uniform. The bench could disrupt the visual flow, and the plaque might look like a private tombstone. Frankly, it's not appropriate." Her choice of words, "not appropriate," made me bristle. I forced a calm tone. "I'm open to suggestions, but please understand this is very important to me. It's not a whim, it's a tribute." Karen smiled that tight-lipped smile. "I understand it's important to you, dear, but we also have a responsibility to the entire community." The rest of the board deliberated for a few minutes. Finally, their spokesperson delivered the verdict. The memorial garden, as proposed, was denied. They cited concerns about neighborhood uniformity and unapproved fixtures in the front yard, referencing the bench and plaque as being non-compliant with guidelines. However, they offered a small concession. I could plant flower beds without any visible sign or structure, provided it matched the usual landscaping style. Essentially, I could have some flowers, just nothing that distinctly marked them as a memorial. My heart sank. I tried to argue, but Karen silenced me by citing the HOA's official documents. "We're not heartless," she insisted. "We simply must uphold our rules. You can certainly have your flowers, but no bench, no plaque, no special border fence. If you do so without compliance, you risk fines." I left the meeting feeling devastated and disillusioned. It struck me how powerless one could feel under the iron grip of an HOA run by someone who didn't care about your story, your feelings, or your sense of personal expression. In the days that followed, neighbors offered sympathy. A few texted or emailed, saying they thought Karen's refusal was overly harsh. One older woman, Harriet, came to my door with a tray of cookies and apologized on behalf of the neighborhood bullies, as she called them. She recalled a time when she tried to install a small weather vane, an heirloom from her late husband's barn, and was shut down in similar fashion by Karen's aggression. Little by little, I gathered that Karen had built a reputation for shutting down unusual ideas. She was the sort to cling to guidelines as if they were gospel, possibly a reaction to some deeper need for control in her life, or maybe she was just petty. Regardless of her motivation, I was sure of one thing. I wasn't ready to give up on my tribute to Grandpa. One day, while poring over local zoning ordinances and city regulations, I discovered a possible loophole. There existed a provision for public-use landscaping, under which certain garden spaces could be considered a type of mini-park or community amenity, subject to a different set of rules. Normally, people didn't invoke this because it brought a new level of municipal oversight, but it also potentially allowed me to sidestep the HOA's power if I opened the space to the public in an official capacity. The idea made me nervous, turning my front yard into a quasi-public area. But then again, maybe I could make it into a community micro-garden dedicated to my grandfather, but also open for neighbors to enjoy. If I managed to register the site with the city's Department of Urban Green Spaces, the HOA might have less ability to stop me. The plan was unorthodox, but in the face of Karen's intransigence, unorthodox might be exactly what I needed. I spent several weeks researching the community microgarden route. I filed paperwork with the city, which required a site plan, a statement of intent, and an application fee. The next step was to present the concept to my city council representative, who surprisingly loved the idea. She thought a small memorial garden could be a charming feature in the neighborhood, especially if it was kept tidy and accessible. She hinted that the city might even be able to provide a small grant for landscaping if I could prove a community benefit. Suddenly, I found myself chasing a more expansive vision, not just a memorial flower bed, but a tiny mini-park for reflection and quiet enjoyment. I imagined a winding path, a few additional benches, maybe some informational signage about local flora, and yes, a discreet plaque honoring my grandfather. If everything was approved, I'd have the right to open the space to the general public during certain hours. The best part? The HOA's authority generally stopped at private landscaping guidelines. But if the city recognized my yard as an official micropark, the HOA might be forced to allow it or at least have limited control over how it was managed. Of course, there was one potential hitch. The city required that such a space be financially self-sustaining if it used any city funds. That meant I might need to charge a small admission fee or secure donations from visitors to pay for upkeep, liability insurance, and so on. At first, I balked at the idea of charging money for people to visit my yard. But then I remembered Karen's dismissive attitude and the repeated references to community standards. If this was to be an official mini-park, complete with signage, safety measures, and city recognition, I couldn't front all the expenses alone. So I decided to propose a minimal admission fee, $1 per entry, with children under 12 free. It felt odd, but I could phrase it as a suggested donation that would fund maintenance. The city official I spoke with found it perfectly reasonable. Small pocket parks, as they're sometimes called, often use donation boxes or nominal fees to sustain themselves. Still, I worried how my neighbors would react. Would they resent paying a fee for a garden in the middle of a residential street? But the official insisted it was my prerogative. If the city approved the site as a public micropark, I could set a small fee for its use. The official also pointed out that many neighbors might not mind, especially if they were sympathetic to the garden's purpose. The next steps were a blur of paperwork and site inspections. I had to coordinate with a city horticulturalist, who visited and reviewed my plans. She was enthusiastic, praising the idea of a community-based memorial garden and offering advice on plant selection. The city council representative followed up with me, happy to sponsor the proposal for a vote at a monthly council meeting. If the council voted yes, I'd get a formal designation plus a small grant for materials. In the back of my mind, I kept wondering when and how Karen would strike back. She was silent for weeks, possibly unaware of my behind-the-scenes efforts. I knew the real battle would begin once she realized I was circumventing the HOA's authority. But I also suspected I had enough local and municipal support that she'd be out of her depth. The pivotal moment arrived on an unseasonably warm autumn evening at a city council meeting. I presented my final plan for the Sunnyvale Memorial Mini Park. A few neighbors tagged along to show support, and a modest crowd of city residents were in the audience. The horticulturalist spoke on my behalf, praising the potential beauty of the space. The council members asked a few questions about parking and hours of operation, but overall, they seemed receptive. Suddenly, the doors at the back of the chamber swung open. In walked Karen, sporting her trademark clipboard. She wore a disapproving scowl as she took a seat near the back. My heart pounded. I had no doubt she'd come to sabotage my plan, or at least register her opposition. The council president asked if anyone in the audience wished to speak before they voted. Karen stood, pen clutched in white knuckles. She introduced herself as a representative of the Sunnyvale Court Homeowners Association. Then she launched into a tirade about how this proposed park would disrupt the aesthetic continuity of the neighborhood. She insisted that my yard was subject to strict HOA guidelines that she believed were inviolable. The presence of signage, benches, and a memorial plaque, Karen declared, would degrade the uniform landscape we have worked so hard to preserve. Several council members exchanged skeptical glances. The horticulturalist rolled her eyes. Karen continued, citing sections of the HOA's rulebook as if that held legal weight in a city council meeting. Finally, the council president cut in. "Ms. Arland," he said, "this proposal adheres to all local zoning requirements. The property owner has the right to apply for a micropark designation. If the city grants it, the micropark guidelines will apply, which can supersede some HOA restrictions. That's well within the property owner's legal rights, provided the conditions are met." Karen's eyes flashed. "But we can't have random members of the public traipsing through our neighborhood," she insisted. "This is a private community with gates." She was about to say more, but the horticulturalist calmly pointed out, Sunnyvale Court is not officially a gated community. It's a standard city street, open to the public, though the HOA does manage some landscaping. Nothing prohibits people from driving in, parking, and walking around. So it's not truly private. Karen's mouth snapped shut as murmurs of agreement ran through the audience. The council president thanked her for her comments, then turned to the other members. Moments later, the council voted unanimously in favor of my mini park. Karen visibly fumed, but she had no official recourse. The city's law stood, and my yard was now officially recognized as a small public garden. In that instance, I felt an almost dizzying sense of relief and excitement. Over the following months, I threw myself into creating the garden. The city grant money helped me purchase new soil, a range of flowers, geraniums, daisies, and a few rose bushes, and even a couple of ornamental shrubs for the perimeter. A friend who worked in landscaping volunteered labor at a discounted rate. We installed a quaint gravel path leading to a circular seating area. There, I placed 2 benches around a small fountain, its gentle trickle lending a soothing background sound. In a discreet yet respectful corner, I added a plaque dedicated to my grandfather, with a short inscription, "In loving memory of Alexander B., a man who helped gardens grow." All the while, I maintained open communication with the city horticulturalist, ensuring everything met their guidelines. A local sign maker donated a small wooden sign for the garden's entrance, calling it Sunnyvale Memorial Mini Park. Just below, in smaller letters, it read, "Public Welcome. Suggested donation, $1. The sign also noted the park's hours, open daily from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. There would be a simple donations box near the entrance, where visitors could drop in $1 if they wished. For liability reasons, I installed a fence around the perimeter with a single gate in the front yard, which I agreed to keep unlocked during opening hours. I remember the day everything was finally in place. The garden was lush with color, pinks, reds, whites, and greens all playing off each other. The bench was exactly as I'd imagined it, a place to sit and reflect. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves of a newly planted maple sapling, and I felt a surge of love for this spot, for Grandpa, for the act of remembering. I walked through the gate and carefully placed the first $1 in the donations box, my own small gesture of gratitude. Word spread quickly in the neighborhood about the mini park. Some residents were thrilled. They popped by to check out the flowers or sit quietly on the bench. A few even left notes thanking me for bringing something beautiful and calming to an otherwise uniform street. Others were more hesitant, uneasy about the notion of random visitors. But to my surprise, it didn't draw huge crowds. My street wasn't exactly a tourist hotspot. Mostly it was the neighbors themselves who visited. Karen, however, was livid. She posted on the HOA's online forum, warning residents that a commercial enterprise was operating on Sunnyvale Court. She complained about potential traffic, noise, and an invasion of privacy. She insisted that the HOA board consider legal action. But the same board that had denied my memorial garden found themselves powerless to override a city-designated micropark. The board's lawyer likely told them the city's stance took precedence, especially because I had fulfilled all municipal requirements. The threat of fines carried no weight now, because the rules for a city micropark overshadowed the HOA's landscaping restrictions. Still, Karen refused to accept defeat. One afternoon, I was in the mini-park with a visitor, an elderly neighbor who'd known my grandfather. We were chatting about the vibrant geraniums when Karen stormed in, no greeting, eyes darting around as if searching for a violation. She pointed at the sign. $1 to visit? You can't be serious. She turned to me, arms crossed. This is unethical, charging neighbors to step onto your yard. I spoke calmly. It's not mandatory, Karen. It's a suggested donation approved by the city. People are welcome to come in without paying if they truly can't afford it. She scoffed. Don't call me that. My name is Beatrice. Then she glared at the older neighbor, who quietly excused herself, slipping out the gate. How dare you drive away our residents with your nonsense fees? I looked her square in the eye. I'm not driving anyone away. The donation helps cover costs for upkeep, water usage, liability insurance. You know that. And I've had a lot of positive feedback from other neighbors, people who appreciate having a peaceful spot. She snorted in disbelief. Oh, I bet. Let's see how long this sham lasts. With that, she turned on her heel and stomped out. A moment later, I heard the clang of the gate as she slammed it behind her. It took me a few minutes to compose myself. I realized that no matter how calm or respectful I was, Karen's sense of control was threatened by this entire project, and she'd probably never come around. In the days that followed, Karen unleashed a flurry of complaints. She called the city code enforcement officers, claiming that I was violating noise ordinances with the fountain. An inspector came out, measured decibel levels, and found it well within limits. She alleged that my fence was too high, but the municipal guidelines clearly allowed it. Next, she said the sign was garish and out of step with the neighborhood. The city horticulturalist responded that it met the micropark sign standards. Every complaint she lodged was systematically dismissed. Frustrated, Karen resorted to whisper campaigns, telling neighbors that outsiders would soon flood the street or that the garden was a breeding ground for insects. But none of those dire predictions came true. In fact, the garden remained a serene little nook, receiving a modest but steady stream of friendly visitors, mostly from Sunnyvale Court itself. The donations box collected a small amount daily, enough to buy fertilizer, replace the occasional damaged plant, and cover part of my water bill. It all came to a head at the next HOA meeting. I decided to attend, curious to see if Karen would launch another public attack. As soon as the meeting started, her scowl telegraphed her displeasure. Under the agenda item New Business, she brought up my mini-park. She insisted it had created confusion and damaged the sense of uniformity. She demanded the board take action, perhaps by seeking an injunction or passing a special rule to ban microparks. Most of the board members seemed fatigued by the saga. Martin, who'd once seemed mild, spoke up firmly. Beatrice, we've gone over this. The city recognized it. We risk a legal challenge we'll almost certainly lose if we try to override it. Lucy, another board member, added, and from the feedback I've heard, most residents actually enjoy having that green space. It's not bringing in hordes of strangers, as you warned. I, for one, think it's lovely. Karen glanced around the room, eyes wide with frustration. She was expecting support, but found little. Even some of her usual allies stayed silent. Finally, she gathered her papers with a shaking hand. I think this entire board has abdicated its responsibility, she snapped. We'll see if you all feel the same way next election. I couldn't hold back a small smile. The more Karen ranted, the more she alienated people who might otherwise have supported her. By the end of the meeting, she was fuming quietly in the corner, alone with her clipboard. Over time, Sunnyvale Memorial Mini Park became a modest neighborhood fixture. Occasionally, visitors from outside the cul-de-sac would stop by, but not many. I'd see parents sitting on the benches, pointing out different flowers to their curious toddlers. A few older folks liked to read quietly under the shade of the maple sapling. Twice a month, I hosted a small gardening workshop, mostly attended by local retirees looking for a new hobby. We'd talk about soil composition, swap seeds, and share gardening tips. All the while, I kept the spirit of my grandfather's love for nature alive. Karen, though, never participated. She steered clear of the garden, unless it was to snap photos of some perceived violation. Even then, she'd huff and puff before leaving. Then one Sunday, I was tending to the flowers when I spotted her peeking through the fence slats. She wore a sour expression. I can't be sure, but it seemed like she actually wanted to come in and explore. Maybe she was curious about the fountain or the plaque, but pride kept her from entering. After a moment's hesitation, she vanished down the sidewalk. A week later, I got word that Karen had tried to file another complaint with the city about my admission fee. She claimed it was exploitative, forcing neighbors to pay to enjoy a space that was previously private. The officials simply reiterated that it was a nominal, voluntary donation. No city code was being broken. The complaint went nowhere. Then one evening, Harriet, the kind older neighbor who once baked me cookies, told me a story that made me laugh out loud. Apparently, Karen had some out-of-town relatives visiting. They'd heard there was a quaint new garden in the neighborhood and wanted to see it. Karen, cornered by her own family's curiosity, had to bring them to the mini park. Harriet watched from across the street. Karen stood stiffly at the entrance while her relatives gushed over the flowers. Then they approached the donations box. Her relatives happily dropped in a few dollars, but Karen froze, as if even the thought of paying a single dollar pained her. Harriet said Karen's face was a picture of reluctance and bitterness. In the end, she either had to pay up or stand outside. Harriet wasn't sure what Karen decided, but either way, it was a direct blow to Karen's pride. Not long after, I found a fresh $5 bill in the donations box, with a note scrawled on a piece of paper, "Beautiful garden." No signature, but I had my suspicions. Maybe Karen's relatives left it. Or perhaps even Karen herself overcame her resentment for a moment. Regardless, it was a small but satisfying victory, proof that the place I'd created could transcend petty neighborhood politics, if only someone was open enough to see its value. Months went by, and my garden became a serene fixture on Sunnyvale Court. The plaque for my grandfather remained the heart of the space. Some visitors asked about him, and I'd share a few memories or mention how he loved daisies best. Neighbors organized small gatherings there, a reading circle, a birthday picnic for a child who loved flowers. The once contentious mini-park started weaving itself into the fabric of community life. Karen, though no longer leading the charge, still made occasional snide remarks online, calling my garden an amateur Disneyland attraction or complaining that the fountain was a drought hazard. But the city had determined that my water usage complied with conservation guidelines, especially since I used a recirculating pump. The more she complained, the more it seemed like an echo in an empty room. Neighbors had grown tired of her negativity and found far more enjoyment in the park than in her gossip. One morning, while pruning the rose bushes, I found an envelope tucked under the donations box. Inside was a letter from a stranger who'd recently lost a family member. She thanked me for providing a space where she could sit quietly and remember her loved one, even though she didn't know me or my grandfather. It moved me to tears. I realized that my little corner of memorial had become something bigger than I ever imagined, a place where others could process grief, find solace, or simply admire nature's gentle beauty. The letter reminded me of the original impetus, Grandpa's legacy. He would have been so proud to see how many people found comfort and joy in something as simple as a well-tended flower garden. I kept the letter, slipping it into a small scrapbook where I'd collected photos of the park's progress. By the time the HOA elections rolled around, Karen tried to position herself as the champion of traditional neighborhood values. She ranted about how the board was too soft and had let me run amok. But the election results were a sharp rebuke. Karen lost her seat on the board. In her place, Lucy, who openly supported the mini-park, was elected. After that, Karen's influence waned dramatically. She still resided on Sunnyvale Court, of course, but her days of holding the neighborhood hostage with threats and petty enforcements were largely over. On a whim, I wrote Karen a polite note, inviting her to share her thoughts on how the garden might better serve the community. I slid it into her mailbox. Days passed with no response. Then, One evening, I discovered the note returned to me, slipped under my door. Across the top in bold letters, she'd written, "No thanks." Underneath, in smaller, angrier handwriting, "Some of us still believe in dignity and tradition." It stung, but I shrugged it off. You can't please everyone. 2 years have passed since the day I first submitted my garden proposal to the HOA. Sunnyvale Memorial Mini Park is flourishing. The city horticulturalist occasionally stops by to check up on it. Every so often, we add a new flower species or a small decorative feature. We installed solar-powered lanterns along the path, so visitors can enjoy the space safely just before dusk. Though it's only open to the public until 6 p.m., the gentle glow in the evening is magical. The donation box consistently collects enough to cover upkeep, and I've started using any surplus to donate seeds to a local community center. In effect, Grandpa's legacy now extends beyond my yard into other corners of the city. Occasionally, the local newspaper runs a small blurb about the park, noting how unusual it is for a residential front yard to achieve official micropark status. Children from a nearby elementary school took a field trip once, and one of the kids told me she wanted to be a gardener someday. It was a full-circle moment that filled me with indescribable gratitude. And Karen? She's still around, but her presence no longer looms large. Once in a while, I catch a glimpse of her power walking down the sidewalk, sneaking a wary glance at the garden. Sometimes, I see her with her grandchildren, who whine about wanting to go inside. Karen either ignores them or quickly crosses the street, refusing to engage. She's made her choice, and I've made mine. The difference is, the rest of the neighborhood can see who's standing in the way of community harmony. I can't say I regret the struggle. If anything, Karen's resistance forced me to fight for something I believed in, which ended up benefiting more people than I originally intended. The irony is that her initial veto turned a simple memorial garden into a public micropark open to neighbors and visitors alike. In trying to keep my yard uniform, she inadvertently gave me the push to create a real gem for our little street. Sometimes, after the gates close for the evening, I'll linger on a bench with a cup of tea, gazing at the flowers swaying under the dimming sky. I'll run my fingers across the plaque that bears my grandfather's name. In these quiet moments, I recall my childhood with him, the lessons learned as I stood by his side, hands in the dirt. He always said that a garden was a testament to hope, planting seeds today for blooms we might only see tomorrow. And in a strange, roundabout way, this entire saga reaffirmed that hope. An HOA dictator tried to quell my dream, but instead, I cultivated a new kind of community. Now, whenever someone approaches me to ask about the micropark, I tell them it was born from adversity, like a seed that pushes through tough soil to reach the sunlight. Sure, there's a small donation box, but the real cost of admission is simply an open mind and a willingness to appreciate beauty in unexpected places. And if Karen wants to join in, she knows the price, a single dollar or a single smile. I'm still waiting to see which one she'll offer first.